Pokemon fans aren't funny. There's totally some diamonds in the rough. I want to have dinner with whoever made this, but that's in the competitive sphere. Most casual fans have, what, 3D Pokemon bad? Bidoof? The wrong house in Undella Town? No. And another knee slapper. Why not use Sinnoh's fire types? Come on, man, get new material. Except, that one's not a joke. Sinnoh, or more specifically Diamond and Pearl's only 2 fire-type Pokemon, are Infernape and Rapidash. That is genuinely a huge issue. In a series about customization and team building, a limited Pokédex can ruin the game for some people. And sure, while Diamond and Pearl aren't the only example of a limited Pokédex, they're probably the worst. And the base Sinnoh Dex isn't just bad, it's also bizarre. Really bizarre. Bizarre enough to talk about even. The lack of fire types is obviously the most well-known issue, and for good reason. If you don't choose Chimchar, you're using Rapidash, like it or not. Honestly, that's your own fault. And Flint of the Elite Four is the poster child of this whole issue, very infamously being a fire-type user where 60% of his team isn't. Volkner has the exact same thing going on, using every single electric type in the region, Raichu and Luxray, because this was before Pachirisu being good was invented. So he fills in the blanks with Ambipom and, oh, my favorite electric type, Octillery. And the ice type leader whose name escapes me too. Already using both the ice type lines available, so she resorts to Medicham and another Snover. Sure, the gym leaders not sticking to one type can make their battles a lot more interesting. We've seen that in Sword and Shield with Raihan using a Sandstorm team instead of just Dragon types. But here, as neat as it may be for Volkner's Octillery to counter any ground types you bring, it really doesn't feel intentional, more like an, oh crap, we ran out of Pokemon! And that's just the obvious stuff right there on the surface. Actually looking at the dex and counting, only 6 grass types, including a starter, is a pretty small pool, especially considering how common it is otherwise. 8 poison lines is relatively a lot, you don't need that much. And, well, the fact that there's 17 fully evolved water types in the region kind of says it all right there. And as a whole, Diamond and Pearl's dex only has 151 entries, which probably isn't a coincidence, let's be honest. And out of the 107 new Gen 4 Pokemon there were, only 81 of them were actually in the dex. And a majority of the missing ones were the new evolutions Sinnoh gave to older Pokemon. A whopping 22 of them, but only 5, Ambipom, Honchkrow, Mismagius, Roserade, and Weavile, were actually available. But you see, we needed Quagsire and Whiscash because our own water ground type just wasn't enough. Even some of the ones that are there are stupidly hard to get. Both Vespiquen and Munchlax forced you to deal with the honey trees with a 6-hour break in between attempts. Not to mention Munchlax only being able to spawn on 4 of the 21 honey trees with a 1% encounter rate, which is fucking evil. There's Spiritomb requiring you to deal with underground shenanigans, having to talk to enough players to make it appear. Feebas is back doing the whole Feebas thing of only appearing on 4 random tiles. There's quite a few trait evolutions just because. Thanks, Mindy. Big fan of your subreddit. And even the Garchomp line is kind of obscure, with Wayward Cave being so sneakily hidden that you probably won't find it unless you already know it's there. The most common response to this, though, is, well, Platinum fixed it, and yeah, that's actually correct. In terms of the variety, at least, Munchlax is still Munchlax. It added 3 more fire type options, which isn't a lot, but it is still more. And the lack of fire types might be a clever reference to how Sinnoh's supposed to be a colder region, but I'd believe that a bit more if there were more ice types too, which Platinum did give us some of. There's 4 more ice type options there, considering Snowrun's split evolution. Electric got another 3 mons. Overall, it added 59 new Pokemon to the regional dex, bringing it up to a solid 210. Still relatively on the smaller side, but it beats out Kanto and Unova now, and just barely surpasses Hoenn. But the most interesting part is, while Platinum did indeed fix the Sinnoh dex by adding more Pokemon to it, only 3 of those guys are actually new to Platinum. Those being Tangela, Tangrowth, and Tropius. All the other ones were obtainable in base Diamond and Pearl perfectly fine. Wait, I just lied. Wouldn't be the first time. They were obtainable, but not perfectly fine. And that's exactly the issue. Though far from the only issue these games have. Every single one of the Pokemon Platinum added, minus the Tangela line and Tropius, were originally post-game content. But they were post-game content in the most bizarre possible way. So Diamond and Pearl's post-game is pretty standard, all things considered. But to even start it, you have to see every Pokemon in the regional dex, which is a chore even with how small it is. But once that's over, you get access to the Battle Zone, which is the main post-game content. You can do the Battle Tower, have a really short quest line where you and Buck track down Heatran, and that's pretty much it. The main draw of the Battle Zone is the Battle Zone itself. 6 new routes to explore, a new dungeon, and a couple towns. And this is where you finally find stuff like the Rhyhorn line for Rhyperior and... wait, that's it? Heck, even in terms of the other new Mons Platinum added to the regional dex, Scyther's here. Sure, there are other Pokemon here that I would have loved to have during the main story, but in terms of Platinum's additions, it's just those 2. And that's because all of these Pokemon locked behind the postgame are done in the most arbitrary way, and they're mostly in mainland Sinnoh. So why don't we start listing them, huh? Bebe in Hearthome City gives you an Eevee, but only in the postgame. There's the Rotom in the Old Chateau, and while its legendary status is debated, it's still postgame only, at level 15, okay. The Pokemon Mansion's Trophy Garden is usually boring, just having Pokemon like Pikachu, Staravia, Roselia, but again, starting in the post-game, Mr. Backlot here, he'll start putting rare Pokemon in, most notably Porygon for Porygon Z. Yanma can be in the Great Marsh after starting the post-game. Nothing special really changes, they're just there now. You get the Pokéradar after completing the regional dex, and alongside being a great shiny hunting tool. Oh, my chain broke again. There's also lots of Pokemon you can find exclusive to it, like Ralts leading to Gallade, Togepi for Togekiss, and even things like Houndoom, which would have been great during the main story. Swarms also start in the post-game, where each day a rare Pokemon that's otherwise unobtainable will appear in a given area. And chief among these are Magnemite, Lickitung, and Swinub with their new evolutions in tow. And since it changes daily, you have to wait for these guys. And dual slot mode. Dual slot mode is like the greediest thing Game Freak's ever done, and they make you buy the DLC twice if you have 2 games. It's worth it. Some Pokemon are only obtainable if you have one of the GBA games in the DS's second slot, thus making them appear in the wild, which also means on the DSi or 3DS, you're out of luck. And the big guys locked behind this are Magby, Elekid, and Gligar, 3 of the most popular new evolutions too. Not to mention their version exclusives. FireRed gives you Elekid, LeafGreen gives you Magby, and Emerald gives you Gligar. Oh, and you don't even, unlock anything in-game here. They just don't start spawning until you get the National Dex. To be fair to Diamond and Pearl, even though I don't want to, some of these weirdly cryptic Pokemon are also in the Battle Zone, so you couldn't get them in the main story even if you didn't have to go through the weird gimmicks. Wait, actually, that's debatably worse. So for the most part, Platinum just took those Pokemon and got rid of the gimmick requirement. Like Magnemite and Houndoom, albeit devolved, are in the same areas that they were, just without the need for Swarms or the Pokéradar. Some Pokemon like Ralts were moved, some were adjusted a lot, like Magby being gone, and instead Magmar is at Fuego Ironworks. Bebe's Eevee and the Rotom are just available before the post-game, simple as that. And in cases like Togepi, who's otherwise still through the Pokéradar in the Battle Zone, or Porygon, who's still in the post-game only Trophy Garden, there's completely new in-game events for them, like Cynthia giving you a Togepi egg or an NPC just handing you a Porygon now. So in a bizarre sense, Platinum actually removed some post-game content. Battle Frontier Schmattle Frontier, Snow Run was supposed to be a reward! That was actually a bit of a point of contention the generation earlier, with the Hoenn games really not having that much post-game content. Until Emerald added the Battle Frontier, there was, the Trick House? Oh, I'm having a blast, eat your heart out, Black and White 2. Especially when compared to Generation 2 and its entire second region. So maybe locking all these Pokemon to the post-game in the next game was a bit of a response to that, sort of the illusion of more content. It forces you to go back across Sinnoh to see everything, so it's kind of like 2 regions again, right? And Platinum's the only Pokemon re-release that shuffles them around like this. Emerald, Crystal, and obviously Yellow, they all have the same regional decks as their base games. Some locations may have been swapped and there's version exclusivity at play, but just playing the game is more or less the same experience. Heck, even with Ultra Sun and Moon, which added a whopping 100 new Pokemon to the regional decks, none of those were in the game previously through Island Scan and stuff. They were a proper addition. Diamond and Pearl's decks was so bad, Game Freak had to do something they'd never done before and would never do since. Not counting Black and White 2 though, because those are sequels, okay? Which then begs the big question, why would they do this in the first place? Are they stupid? Yes. Well, Diamond and Pearl weren't the first games with a stupidly limited roster, with the Johto games, Base Gold and Silver in particular, also having a really limited dex, especially when it comes to getting the new Pokemon. Like, you couldn't get Sneasel in Gold and Silver until you reached Mount Silver, you know, the area where you fight Red. And it's commonly assumed, alongside typical early Pokemon jank, that this was done to encourage trading, especially considering how relatively low-leveled some of these guys are. In the post-game Kanto, where you're almost reaching level 50, you can get Houndour at around level 15. It's only found here on Kanto Route 7, yet it's balanced enough to be traded over to someone just reaching Whitney, even if that's not the best idea. And that same theory applies here, with the Pokemon from the Swarms or Radar being around the same level as the other Pokemon in that area. And since Ralts, for example, is found through the Radar on Route 203, it'll be around level 5, really not being that useful to you in the post-game. But it might be useful to someone who still needs a Psychic type. These level disparities aren't even limited to the weird post-game stuff either, with some Pokemon in the Battle Zone being around level 20. More specifically, it's stuff like Rhyhorn and even the Fire-type Numel that are around there, and even Gligar and Magby from the dual slot thing. These Pokemon that would be perfect for trading in the first place have levels that make it feasible mixed among all the level 50s of the area. And speaking of encouraging trading, these games have a shockingly large amount of trade evolutions. Like all 4 from Kanto plus Steelix are in the regional decks, and among all the new evolutions, 5 of those need to do it to evolve. But then that brings us away from talking about why is the Sinnoh Dex the way it is to why do they want us to trade so bad, and simply put, it's probably because of the internet. Insert joke about the internet ruining something here, okay? This game didn't introduce the GTS since that was actually in Crystal through the mobile system GB, which coincidentally was also a gen that had this problem. But with it, it was easier than ever to find a Pokemon you need and even easier to put whatever you want up on offer. Well, theoretically. See, the GTS in Gen 4 is pretty different than the one we have now, in the sense that it's terrible. You can only trade for a Pokemon if you've already seen it. And since trade evolutions just don't activate over the GTS, the only practical use this could have during the story is getting the other starters. However, this wasn't the only way to trade with people online. With the Palpad, you could register friend codes and just connect with people whenever. So no matter how you look at it, trading in Gen 4 was just easier than it used to be. The way the devs saw it was probably something like no link cables, no need to be in the same room even. So theoretically, you could get a fire type whenever you want. And I guess things never change, huh? Why does this guy want a Kyogre? And the sheer amount of water types might tie into this too. Surf and Waterfall are required HM moves to play the game, even though you can hardly call this playing. So those couldn't be locked to trades, while fire types you can realistically do without. Of course, there's no confirmation of this, but considering it not only lines up so well, but has also happened before, it wouldn't be too surprising. But also, because it's not confirmed, it might run a bit deeper than that. So remember how the Diamond and Pearl Dex has 151 Pokemon exactly? Well, nostalgia baiting may have influenced the Dex, even if just a little bit. Generation 4 started the Kanto pandering way before Gen 6 kicked it into high gear. Magmortar and Electivire were some of the poster childs of the generation, even though they're Gen 1 evolutions. Professor Oak is just in these games for no real reason. Orberg Gym is scarily close to Pewter Gym in both layout and Rourke's team. And among Sinnoh's 5 mythicals, only Manaphy has a spot in the regional Dex. 151, just like Mew. And it's also worth noting that the Dragon type is super limited too, with your only option aside from the box legend being the Gibble line. The only Dragon type is the pseudo-legendary of the region. And considering this game was released 10 years after Red and Green in Japan, all of this stuff, plus the more limited Dex, may have been done to almost celebrate Gen 1. The same way Base Sun and Moon were just a little bit rushed to reach the 20th anniversary deadline. And that's the last component to Diamond and Pearl's Dex too, being rushed. It's not much of a secret that these games aren't very well made.
Your final step. 你手臂夠對右方。
These games were indeed rushed. Very rushed. And if you couldn't tell from the stuff like the NPC trainers not even having an AI, so they just click moves at random, we might be able to tell judging by the beta content we've seen. In fact, it goes beyond just seeing stuff. People have found beta builds of the game with dates attached. The earliest one we have access to is from February 17th, 2006, just over 7 months from the game's initial release date. So surely this build must be at least close to done, right? I don't remember Wally being in the final game. Yeah, just over half a year before the game was supposed to come out, it was still grossly early in development. They haven't even implemented button controls for the battle menu yet, it's touchscreen only. It's not a far cry to assume that they simply didn't have time to properly balance the Pokédex. And interestingly, Weavile, one of the few cross-gen evolutions that is available before the post-game, though it's as late as Victory Road because that's where the Razor Claw is, was indeed one of the first new Pokemon implemented. Meanwhile, lots of the other cross-gen evolutions took way longer to actually be fully put in. Looking at later prototypes, for instance the one that blessed us with Beta Arceus, we can see things like Glaceon and Leafeon's unfinished back sprites, Magmortar's unfinished front sprite, Probopath looking like this, Beyond Mega looking like that, Togekiss having a completely different design, all while coincidentally the 5 cross-gen evolutions that are available during the story are already done. Mostly, Honchkrow and Mismagius's back sprites aren't quite there yet, but still, there's a solid chance that when they were deciding on what the deck should be like and balancing around it accordingly, some of the Pokemon weren't finished yet. Now admittedly, this theory isn't foolproof, with Dusknoir, Frostlass, and Tangrowth also having completely finished sprites in this build while not appearing in the Sinnoh decks. But also, this build is from June 30th, like 3 months before the game came out. I would hope they'd have some finished sprites by then. And the last bit is that there's a solid chance that they locked these evolutions away on purpose. Looking at where the Gen 4 Pokemon are in the national decks, all of the cross-gen evolutions are lumped together at the very end, except for Roserade, Ambipom, Honchkrow, and Mismagius, with Weavile acting like a sort of cutoff point. And with their weird and unique evolution methods, maybe they were considered almost legendary, like the Dratini line in Gen 1? Well, no matter why they did it, they still did it and it was bad. The entire Sinnoh Dex is just such an enigma. Hell, even ignoring all the Diamond and Pearl gameplay stuff, why is Garchomp, this region's pseudo-legendary, just smack dab in the middle? When Platinum updated the decks, it quite literally just tacked stuff on after the Diamond and Pearl 151. So it goes Dialga, Palkia, Manaphy, then Rotom into Gligar. It's so unorganized. Not to mention that this is the only region with legendaries and mythicals that just aren't in its regional decks. The slots for the mythicals aren't usually shown in the decks until you have them, except for Manaphy, weirdly enough, but they did all still have secret entries in their given regional dexes. Phione, Shaman, Darkrai, Arceus, Cresselia, and Heatran didn't have a spot in any regional decks until Legends Arceus. And I've also neglected to mention Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl this entire time, and while usually that'd be a good thing, it actually does do a bit to fix this issue. The underground in the original game was practically just for multiplayer stuff. You could find rare items down there, but the main draw was capture the flag and all the traps that came with. And while unfortunately BDSP got rid of 90% of that because it hates fun, it did give us Pokemon hideaways where you can find, well, Pokemon. And down there is a chance that Pokemon originally exclusive to the postgame will spawn. In fact, these postgame Pokemon have their very own spawning slot. Sure, some things like Eevee and Porygon are still postgame only, with a couple being in the underground yet only appearing after you get the national dex, so what's the point? But there's still stuff like Togepi, Ralts, Rhyhorn, Magby, and Elekid, even though they're version locked, with the Pokemon FireRed gave you going to Brilliant Diamond and the LeafGreen ones going to Shining Pearl. So overall, Diamond players end up with a whopping one more Fire type option. It's also worth noting that unlike Platinum, BDSP didn't adjust any of the wild Pokemon's levels in the battle zone, so now the Rhyhorn over there are level 22 for quite literally no reason. The Diamond and Pearl Pokédex is at the very least interesting. Not necessarily in a good way, but interesting nonetheless. And BDSP improves it a bit and Platinum is infinitely better, so at least Sinnoh as a whole isn't getting dragged down. And hey, if you still like Diamond and Pearl in spite of this, all the more power to you. I hate them, but I also like Scarlet and Violet, so I don't think it's my place to say anything. And you know what? Considering how bare recent post-games have been, maybe Diamond and Pearl were on the right track. That's what the new games have been missing, all the replay value found by unlocking Jinx. Move over, new games, I've got the classics. Yep, the series was all downhill from here.